The Gospel according to Matthew, chapter 13, beginning at verse 31. Listen for God's word. Jesus put before them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed that someone took and sowed in his field. It is the smallest of all the seeds, but when it has grown, it is the greatest of shrubs and becomes a tree so that the birds of the air come and make nests in its branches. He told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed with 3 measures of flour until all of it was leavened. The word of the Lord.
Life-shaping stories indeed. When I was 13, my family made the obligatory pilgrimage to Orlando. Our Mecca was Disney, because it turned out my parents had gotten a sweet deal on a friend's timeshare, and so off we set. It was the middle of the school year, my grade 8 year of middle school, which meant that I got to not only put off writing my science midterm, for which I was not ready, but I also got to escape the frigid hellscape that is Nova Scotia in February. Keep in mind, I didn't know about the prairies yet. So off we went, and I remember stepping out of the airport into 100-degree humidity in February, and honestly wondering, why doesn't everyone live here? Keep in mind, though, I didn't yet know about hurricanes, alligators, or giant spiders yet either. So we loaded our bags into our rental car and unfolded our map of Ontario because it was the 90s. Our timeshare was part of a large condo complex, and that itself was fairly unremarkable, but it did have 2 features that caught my attention immediately. The first was full cable, and I mean full cable. Hundreds upon hundreds of channels in every genre, from stand-up comedy to old-timey reruns to sci-fi, an entire section of sports channels. Whatever I wanted to watch, I could watch at any point in time. And so I plunked myself down on the overstuffed sofa with the remote in hand and began to scroll. Meanwhile, my dad was furiously combing the condo in panic, pulling everything he could find out of his pockets, unpacking his suitcase, looking desperately for something that seemed to be missing. With beachwear strewn across the floor, his face red, I imagine from a combination of panic and frustration, I remember having a vague recollection of answering the question of whether or not I had seen the car keys in the negative. But I was too busy surfing to pay much attention to what they were doing. The other feature that the timeshare had was this monstrosity. Being greeted by this when you first walk into a condo lets the teenage imagination run wild. As far as I knew, only supervillains and the obscenely wealthy have safes all their own. And so, figuring that a code was essentially a name for a device, 290484 would basically claim the safe as mine. That's my birthday, in case anyone decides to try to steal my wallet after the service today. However, one of the features that the timeshare decided to wisely install was that the safe wouldn't arm if there was nothing inside of it. So I went looking for the first innocuous object I could find and that I could secure in my vault. That was when I first saw the TV. Minutes later, firmly engrossed in my sea of reruns, my parents scrambled to find their missing car keys. They had resigned themselves to needing to call the rental company and pay whatever the excessive fee would be to get our second set of keys driven out to us, when my TV-addled brain recalled that what I had stowed away in that vault for safekeeping. 290484, and the wall safe retracted its heavy steel bars to reveal the missing car keys. I feebly tried to justify to my parents that I just didn't want the keys to get lost. But I learned an important lesson that day, that not all hiding places are created equal. Jesus tells us as much in two short stories that are more simile than parable. He explains that the reason he actually spends so much of his time teaching in parables is because he wants to reveal something that's been hidden. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed. The kingdom of heaven is like yeast. These two stories are as small as the objects they employ. But here Jesus uses them to maximum effect. The kingdom of heaven has been hidden, Jesus seems to say, like a mustard seed in the ground or like yeast into a ball of dough. But sit with that truth for a second. Aren't those terrible hiding places? I think they are. But I also think that's Jesus' point. See, the fun is in the finding. You learn this if you've ever played hide and go seek with your kids or your grandkids. Especially when they're really little and they insist on hiding in the same place over and over again, hiding behind the living room curtains with their little socks sticking out for the seeker to find. Or each and every time they go hiding, crouching behind the same couch in the same place. And remember then, too, the joy that overflows when that kid runs off to hide again after they've been found. Because they know this life-shaping gospel truth, that the fun is in the finding. That was my takeaway from this morning's parables. Now take a step back from it. Take a step back and pretend that you haven't heard for the last 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years that you've been a follower of Jesus, that you haven't heard that the kingdom of heaven is like a seed of mustard 1,000,000 times. Pretend you haven't heard the parable of the yeast before. What does it stir inside of you? If the goal of these parables was some kind of unwavering belief, if that was Jesus' mandate, don't you think he would tell his followers that the kingdom of heaven is like a mighty cedar, strong and unmoving? Don't you think he might suggest that the kingdom of heaven is more thunderstorm than yeast? He might, if his goal were to sell a program, to convince you or his followers to leave, breathe, act, or be in a certain kind of way. If religion for religion's sake was Jesus' objective, then that may well be how he would tell his stories. But religion of that kind has never been part of Jesus' mission. He tells us that he is revealing something that's been hidden, but hidden well within reach. That's the literal translation, by the way, that Matthew renders here, I will proclaim. It's really more a sanitization than a proper translation. The word Matthew uses, erukamai, is actually a Greek word that means to bring up from within. It's the word for regurgitate. Matthew is giving us something that's been inside all along. So don't think that there's any kind of secret knowledge to be gained here. There's no gnosis or apocalypse happening. There's nothing being revealed that's new when Jesus speaks in parables. And the truth that he conveys doesn't come from outside of us. It isn't found in the splendor of a sunset or in the sublimity of community. The purpose of these life-shaping stories is to bring to light what was already inside all along, hiding in plain sight, sitting just below the surface, crouching behind the couch for the 100th time. Because the fun is in the finding. I think when you find something, you feel a sense of ownership for that thing, don't you? You take a kind of responsibility for it. It becomes important to you. Give a child a piece of chocolate, and they'll devour it and then move on to the next thing. But let that child hunt for a chocolate egg or a chocolate bunny, and they will savor it week after week after week. Then they will proudly show off their spoils to anyone that will pay attention to them. God has wired us to take that kind of ownership of the kingdom of heaven. And he's done that by placing it within the reach of anyone willing to hear the simple, gracious truth of Christ that the kingdom of heaven is small enough for you. It is small enough to be held in the palm of your hand, and it is small enough to be lost. Indeed, this seems to be Jesus' point. A mustard seed only becomes the king of condiments if you have it in abundance. Likewise, one does not live on yeast alone. Their telos, their created, intended purpose is only found when we give up the idea that this thing exists for us to hold on to it. A mustard seed becomes home for a flock. A bit of yeast feeds a multitude. Because it's in the losing that we become a blessing beyond ourselves. Find it. It's hiding just below the surface. Own it. You have a piece to play in it. Lose it, because it was never intended for you, and grow it so that it can become more of a blessing than you can imagine. This is the rhythm of life-shaping faith. Find it. You will never be ready enough. You will never have enough answers or be confident enough or prepared enough to venture out onto a journey of faith on your terms. This is why God has placed faith where he did. He's placed it within us. And to paraphrase Augustine, God is shallow enough for a child not to drown and deep enough for an elephant to swim. It is within everyone simply because it is for everyone and for anyone. When we treat faith like it's the end of a story, when we treat it like it's what good people get as a reward for a lifetime of being good people, we miss the point of Jesus' parables. Faith is not where the journey ends, but where the journey starts. Faith is the beginning point of a journey into a journey of following Jesus. It is the cry of the desperate parent in the Gospels, I believe, now help my unbelief. Because there are no tricks here. There's no smoke and mirrors. There's no quick illusion. The author of Ecclesiastes simply puts it this way. God has set eternity in the hearts of mortals. He has created us in his image and oriented us toward his way of being. And so when we grieve a life that has ended too soon, it is eternity crying out within us to be found again. When we shake our fists at injustice in the world and rage against evil, we are acknowledging that there is a way that the world is supposed to be, that there is a supreme court over creation itself. And when we are unsatisfied with the status quo, it is because we are made to be citizens of kingdom come. God has placed eternity in the hearts of all of us. So own it. For too long, the church has made faith the purview of theologians and pastors. When I first arrived at St. Andrews, I was asked why Presbyterians believe that only ordained ministers could lead Bible studies. We do not. Jesus didn't leave his throne in glory and go through the muck and mire of being born to a peasant refugee teenager, living a miserably ascetic life and dying an agonizing death to ensure only that his lessons were passed on perfectly and without corruption. If that had been Jesus' goal, his 12 disciples, the people he would have surrounded himself with, would have been theologians and scribes rather than fishermen and tax collectors. The good news that Jesus came to inaugurate is that God is investing in humanity. God is beginning a new work, and he's not the one doing it this time. This time, God is calling you and me and all of us to pick up our cross and follow from where we are led. And it's you that he's tasked this work with, of owning the faith that he has hidden inside you. God is not looking for perfect, polished people. He simply wants to show you what he can do with the mess you make. The emergent theologian Brian McLaren puts it this way: Jesus was short on sermons, but long on conversations. Short on answers, but long on questions. Short on telling you what to think, and long on challenging you to think for yourself. So lose it. This may be the most challenging part of speaking about a life-shaping faith. Because the world tells us that we measure success not by what we lose, but by what we gain. The same world tells us that the church that best meets our needs will be the church that survives the longest in a crowded marketplace. So we consume church, and we compete for resources, and we hold tightly onto our mustard seed, and we hold our measure of yeast in a closed fist. Kay was 98 years old when I left the church in Grenfell. She had outlived 4 husbands and had been a church elder longer than I'd been alive. She was a Presbyterian before church union, and when the Presbyterian Church was reconstituted in Grenfell in 1991, she was among the first members. If anyone had a right to claim the way the church should look, act, and be, it was Kay. And so when at our annual congregational meeting in 2015, almost a year ago to today, or almost 3 years ago to today, rather, as was usually the case in mainline congregations, the conversations changed to being about rejuvenating a declining church. And Kay stood up in that meeting with tears in her eyes and an unwavering conviction in her voice and announced to the congregation that day that she was willing to do whatever it took to make her congregation a place young people wanted to belong, up to and including being willing to stay home on Sunday if she was the problem. I adjourned the meeting because there was nothing left to say. Our faith was never meant for us any more than a single mustard seed is satisfying on a hot dog or yeast and peanut butter makes for a satisfying breakfast. Our faith only satisfies when we lose it, when we give it away, when we bury it, when it becomes other to us. It becomes satisfying when we begin to treat the newcomer as more important to us than the seasoned member. As when we treat the poor with more honor than the rich, the lost as more worthy of grace than the righteous. So grow it. Because you can't unsow a seed and you can't unleaven a loaf. The willful act of faith will always produce a change. Because know that a single act of faith forever alters the composition of the universe. Mountains may not move, but make no mistake, the cosmos will never be the same after an act of faith. That is what makes this life-shaping faith. Faith always produces a reaction, even if it is just in the sower or in the baker. Faith changes everything. And the more you do something, the easier it becomes to do it again and again and again. Faith is habit forming. Think about the first time that you learned how to drive. You thought about how many times and to what degree you had to turn your head to execute a proper shoulder check. You have to switch the car into this gear, use your right foot on the gas on the right and the brake in the middle and the clutch on the left, and then you have to switch into reverse, and sometimes reverse is up here, but sometimes it's down here. The energy that goes into learning how to drive quickly transitions over years and years of driving into something that you can do by habit, where you can pull out of your driveway and pull into work without really remembering how you got there. That is the power of habit. Jesus never calls us to be soul shapers or world changers. He leaves that up to the Spirit. Our job is to shape our own lives according to the rhythm of faith. Find it, own it, lose it, grow it, and watch what God does next. So to the glory of the risen Christ, and to the Father, and to the Spirit, all glory and honor, majesty and authority, now and always.